So first of all, thank you so much to True University, to True Ventures, for inviting me to True University. It's a privilege to come here and speak to you all today, especially given the variety of choices you could have spent your time otherwise. So I want to make sure that it's actually useful to you. So I'll give a little background on myself. Thank you for the gracious introduction. I sort of sit in a unique vantage point because I'm a psychologist in tech. And so it sort of feels like sometimes being an outside observer. And so the nice thing is sort of in the evolution of my career, going from being a clinician to being an entrepreneur and now being an investor, you get to sort of see company culture from multiple vantage points. And so I have a very particular vantage point that comes from sort of my clinical background, and that's what I hope to share with you and hopefully give you very actionable insights that you can take with you and use in your companies. So just as an introductory exercise, if you could raise your hands if somewhere in your company, and that could be in an employee workbook, it could be somewhere written on the wall, it could be written on your internet, you've actually written down what your company's cultural values are. So raise your hands if that's codified somewhere. Awesome, that's the majority of hands in the room. That's fantastic. So I want you to raise your hands again, however, if you can actually quantitatively tell me how well your company is actually doing in terms of living those values. So for instance, if you have a value that is treat each other with respect and kindness, you can tell me that 79% of your employees, for example, strongly agree with that statement. Raise your hand. It's very few hands. All right, so third and last question. So even if you have sort of quantified how well you're doing against your cultural values, how many companies here are actually meeting regularly to see where they can sort of bridge the gap and are taking actionable steps and feeling like they're making progress in terms of improving that value? So if you wanted to get that metric up to 90%, you're actually taking active and sustained efforts towards improving that. Raise your hand. Maybe a few hands left. So isn't that an interesting observation, right? So most people here, if you did a sort of informal survey, would say that company culture obviously matters a lot. And we certainly take the effort to write down or share what those cultural values are, but very few companies actually take the actual concrete steps of measuring and trying to improve those things. So that's an interesting starting point, and I can hopefully provide some viewpoints about how we can improve that over time. So part of the inspiration actually for the talk was from the Netflix culture deck. Have you all seen this? It's a great deck that was passed around many years ago. And there's a quote in the deck from one of the slides that says, the actual company values, as opposed to the nice sounding values, are shown by who gets rewarded, promoted, or let go. So this is not my observation. This is an observation that many people who've worked in startups, technology, even I would say corporations in general, have noticed, is oftentimes there's a wide chasm, or that's why I say sort of mind the gap, between what the company says that their values are and what sort of practice in real life, right? And if you've been around and worked in enough companies, you've probably observed that sort of firsthand. And so I always thought this was a very curious phenomenon because especially as a psychologist, we're very sensitive to things like cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is basically when there's a gap between what people believe and what people do. And cognitive dissonance actually creates a lot of turmoil in people because people don't like hypocrisy. People don't like seeing sort of hypocrisy or people not practicing what they preach. And in fact, I think it's sort of the death knell for a lot of company cultures. So I was kind of curious, why is this the case and what can we do to change that? So what I think is actually useful, and I think this is the part where a lot of people sort of get wrong, is there's a difference between what I call aspirational values and what are the actual values of your company, right? And there's nothing wrong with being aspirational. I think all of us should aspire in our companies to have values that we hope to live up to and hope to improve over the course of our company in terms of getting there. But I think it's very important, and this is kind of putting the clinician hat on, to be a little diagnostic and understanding where your company's culture is at the present moment. So what I think is actually important is to very much understand what that values gap is. And so these are sort of simple equations, but I think they're useful sort of frameworks for how do you think about this, right? So what I call the values gap is basically the difference between the aspirational and versus the practiced values, right? So you may, in the founding sort of formation days of your company, say, here are the 5 or here are the 10 things that we want our company to stand for. Fantastic. Those are your aspirational values. But it's very important to actually realize, okay, now that we actually started our company, now that we're at this stage of growth, how are we actually doing against that? So that's the sort of the diagnostic part. And what I call the sort of the prognostic part, or the part in which you have faith that this is going to actually improve, is doing the 2 things that I sort of mentioned, which is I think it's actually critically important to measure how you're doing in terms of your cultural values, and 2, take efforts to improve them, right? Because basically, if you are not measuring your company's cultural values in terms of how well you are practicing against that sort of aspirational ideal, and you're not taking sort of sustained and concrete efforts to improve your cultural values, the likelihood of change is essentially 0, right? And you see this all the time. There's a lot of companies, I would bet most of the companies here, probably once a year you do like an annual engagement survey. You try to get a pulse on how people are feeling at the company. And I think that's a fantastic first step, right? The biggest problem with sort of those engagement surveys is almost nothing gets done from them. You sort of identify even maybe where the gaps are, but there's very few concrete steps that are done. So I think it's important to sort of do both of those things, is that if you are doing sort of engagement surveys, and hopefully they are more frequent than once a year, it's actually important, I would actually argue, to build into the survey, let's say you have those sort of 5 things that you want your companies to stand for in terms of its cultural values. Ask everyone at the company, how well are we doing in terms of living up to those values? And if there is a gap, if there is a values gap, then I think it's useful to sort of have a team, and that has to be beyond just the HR team. They can't be totally responsible for changing the company's culture, to come up with an action plan, meet regularly, and take efforts to do it. Now, one final thought, and this is perhaps a sort of a controversial thought, but I actually would argue that it's better to have no stated values at the beginning of your company, especially in the early stages, than to be hypocritical about them. Because the biggest issue is exactly the observation that you see in the Netflix deck. Is one of the things I do a lot of advising and consulting and coaching with companies is you walk in, and usually somewhere on a wall you see this beautiful panel of cultural values that people have sort of nicely designed or carved out of wood. And then you actually sit in on meetings, you sort of observe how people interact with one another, you sit down and have sort of private, confidential one-on-ones, and you're like, that's not the company's cultural values at all. There's a huge gap between that, right? And I think that's where sort of the cognitive dissonance and the hypocrisy sort of come into place, right? If I sort of, as an outsider, can come in like a day or a week and sort of notice that there's a huge discrepancy between what is said and what is done, certainly the employees that are there day in and day out for years see that, right? And so if they sort of observe that and you're not doing a good job of living that, then I think that's where sort of the dissonance comes in. So I think it's actually an act of humility to say as a company, yeah, you know, maybe we don't really know what our values are, or perhaps we do have aspirational values, but maybe we don't have the time or the resources or the priority right now to measure and approve it. So in the interim, we're not going to make bold claims about who we pretend to be. Right? Now, that doesn't mean if you don't state your values, you don't have a company culture. You clearly do, because on a day-to-day basis, how you behave is your company's culture. But at least there isn't that sense of hypocrisy or discrepancy between what you're saying and what you're doing. So why do behaviors persist? And so as a clinical psychologist, I have a particular lens on this because I'm a behaviorist at heart. So all of the therapies that I practice are very behavioral at heart. And I think it's actually a very useful framework for understanding why people act the way that they do. So one of the key sort of tenets of behaviorism, and a lot of people may be familiar with behaviorism, and if you ever studied sort of psychology in college in terms of conditioning, right? So classical conditioning is like the classic sort of Pavlov's dogs in terms of getting them to salivate when they ring a bell, and also, you know, with even like you see like circus animals, you can train a bear to like roll on a ball through operant conditioning, where you sort of slowly shape a behavior by providing reinforcement over time. So you can train, whether it's animals or human beings, to do a lot of things over time. And one of the core sort of tenets of behaviorism is basically no behavior persists long-term unless it's reinforced, right? People don't do things haphazardly. So even behaviors that we might consider to be harmful or pathological, someone is getting something out of it, even if it's sort of harmful in other ways. They're getting some sort of reward for it. And so we think about it usually in terms of reinforcement. So the first part of it is sort of positive reinforcement. And when I say positive, that's not a sort of a value judgment. Positive in behavioristic language really means the addition of something. So the obvious thing is the addition of a reward, right? So in a workplace context, rewards are usually, the biggest rewards are sort of promotion or praise, right? So people act in ways that will be in their best sort of self-interest that are going to result in them getting a promotion and praise. And so people are very attuned to obviously what their managers and what the leadership are doing in terms of they'll see sort of, well, you know, Bob or Jane is sort of acting in this way and she ended up getting promoted. I should probably engage in very similar behaviors, right? The other sort of reinforcement is sort of negative reinforcement. And negative means the subtraction or the taking away of something. So negative reinforcement is sort of removing a punishment. Now, commonly in sort of workplace settings, that could be like a probationary period, right? So if you're sort of early on at the company and you're sort of being evaluated for 6 or 12 months, the removal of that probationary period is a reinforcement. Or if you're sort of put on a lot of sort of lower level or undesirable tasks, and you do a good job, and they're like, okay, you know, we'll sort of leave those sort of scut work to someone else, and now you can do sort of the fun or interesting or creative stuff. That is also sort of a reinforcement. The third type, and this is sort of a little bit more implicit, is what I actually call passive reinforcement. So particularly if you're talking about sort of bad or pathological behavior, unless the organization is very, very dysfunctional, most people aren't actually rewarding pathological behavior. At least you certainly hope not. But what happens a lot more commonly is that there's sort of passive reinforcement, where the management may not be directly reinforcing that behavior and say, hey, good job for being a jerk. That's obviously not what most managers want to do, but they allow it to persist, right? And what happens is when you sort of allow it to persist is that it gets reinforced indirectly, because the individual might be getting their own reinforcement from acting that way, right? So maybe if it's sort of like bolstering their ego to sort of put someone else down, they're sort of getting their individual sort of positive reinforcement from that behavior. And because management is not sort of introducing positive punishment in terms of letting them get away with it, that's how that sort of passive reinforcement continues to happen, right? So that's why I think it's really important the takeaway from all of this is to remember that behavior is essentially never accidental, right? Now you may sort of in a very acute circumstance or on a very bad day, you might sort of act out of character, but there's no way sort of someone continues to act in a certain way unless they're getting something out of it, and that's always happens through reinforcement. The other key thing that I think is very useful from social psychology is that behavior is learned. Now, there are people that sort of, you can say, are sort of dispositionally pathological, and later on in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But for the most part, for a lot of people, behavior is learned, and this is sort of based on this premise called social learning theory. And that's the idea that behavior is sort of modeled. And one of the key premises that I have, especially if you're talking about early stage startups, is that usually culture really starts from the top. Right? It comes from the company's initial founders, because they sort of not only set the tone and the initial culture for the company, but they are sort of the holders of the reinforcement levers, right? Because the buck stops with the founders, and they can essentially, short of the board, hire, fire, and promote anyone, right? So the people who hold the keys to hiring, firing, promoting, and praising people are the people who set the culture. Now, of course, what happens is as your company grows and you sort of develop a little bit more of a hierarchy, you start to bring in vice presidents and sort of managers of certain divisions and departments. And those people, usually through the company's founders, become sort of the people who are setting the tone for the company culture, right? And so that's what I sort of call trickle-down behavior. So the initial sort of cultural values from the founders trickle down to the managers, and then the managers sort of, through this process of reinforcement, set the sort of company's culture as that sort of grows and evolves over time. And the thing is, employees are actually very astute in observing what's going on, right? They're paying attention to who is being hired, who is being promoted, who is being praised, and also who is getting away with things, right? And so oftentimes as your company is sort of scaling, the founders are not aware of all the things that are going on. They're no longer having necessarily one-on-one meetings or even one-on-one relationships when your company's going to a point where it's, let's say, over 100 employees, right? So at this point, it's sort of the managers and perhaps even under them, the frontline managers that are responsible for rewarding, reinforcing the employees. And so the key thing that I sort of encouraged you to think about is that your company's employees practice the behaviors that are valued, not the values that you espouse, right? So regardless of what's sort of stated or claimed in terms of what's important at your company, people know what's important at your company because they sort of pay attention and see what do people get away with, what do people get praised for, and then they're like, okay, those are the values, right? So what ends up happening oftentimes in companies is that there's almost two sets of values, right? The stated ones and sort of the implicit ones. And hopefully those things are as close together as possible in a very congruent and positive company culture. But in a lot of places, those are totally separate. And of course, people follow the implicit ones. So how do you make sure that your company's culture is positive and that you're doing a good job of living the values? So the first and foremost is, of course, hire great people, right? Even though behaviors are sort of learned, that doesn't mean that people are starting from total scratch in terms of being a blank slate when they come to your company. People often have a long history of working at other workplaces from schools in which they've also learned sort of the rules of the game of surviving and thriving in academia or in corporate America, right? And so it's critically important, obviously, to get the best people that you can. And I think the best way you can do that is just to start in the interview process, right? So just as I said, it's actually critically important to assess how your company is doing in terms of its values in employee engagement surveys. You should do the same exact thing in every single interview that you do, right? So if there are whatever 5 to 7 traits that you consider to be your company's values, then include that in a template during the interview process. And you can do this in multiple ways. This could be during sort of the one-on-one interviews where it could be a template and you ask very specific questions around it. So like one company, they sort of have the Koru 7, and I like using this in my own interview processes. They look for these 7 traits, which are grit, sort of resilience, how rigorous are they in the way that they think and do they work, what's the impact that they've had in their previous jobs, are they a team player, do they take ownership, do they take responsibility for the work that they do, are they sort of curious, are they proactive, are they sort of self-learners, and are they sort of polished in the terms of, do they have good presentation skills, do they work well with others, especially in sort of a sales role, do they present well? So if these are the things that your company, for instance, says are important, you can fill it in with your own sort of cultural values. You should be going through and evaluating every single candidate against that. The other way you can also do it is through reference checking, right? Now, some of these things are obviously difficult in the context of a 30 to 60-minute interview to assess. Like a lot of people will say grit is a very important characteristic, but how do I assess that in a 30 to 60-minute interview? Now, sometimes you can. You can ask people, like, tell me about a time where you had a very difficult or challenging project at work and how you managed that, right? And so you can sort of use these sort of previous situations to sort of assess how people are doing. But I actually think reference checks are incredibly important. So Andreessen Horowitz, for instance, has a recommendation of even doing sometimes up to 6 reference checks, which sounds a little extreme, but if you really, really value your company's culture and your goal is to avoid sort of bad hires as much as possible, I actually think it's well worth the time and effort to even perhaps go overboard and do the reference checks. The other reason that I actually think doing multiple reference checks, preferably backdoor reference checks, are better is because you have to take them a little bit with a grain of salt. You have to obviously understand sort of the context in which people are providing feedback about previous employees. And sometimes because of strained relationships or conflicts or other things, people might provide a negative reference. But when you do 4 or 5 or 6, you can sort of judge one negative reference in the context of greater ones. If you're only doing 1 or 2, I think what happens is they sort of get disproportionate impact and you're like, oh man, I don't want to deal with that, right? So the more you do, you have a little bit of a better context of people. Ideally, you obviously want to talk to someone who is their manager, a peer, and someone who worked below them if they were in a managerial capacity. So you have a little bit more of that 360-degree view. The other rule that I think is really important is the no asshole rule. So this is actually developed by Professor Bob Sorton, who's a professor of organizational behavior at Stanford Business School. Wrote a whole book on it. I highly recommend it. But he's basically making the argument that, look, no matter how phenomenal and skilled an employee is, if they're an asshole, it should be an automatic deal breaker, no matter what, right? Now, a lot of people, or a lot of organizations, I would say, claim they have a no asshole rule, but they certainly don't follow that in practice. The best way you can do that is just use the interview process as meticulously as possible to do that. So how do you do that? And as I was saying, interviews are sort of an imperfect thing because it's a very small slice of time that you don't often have a sense of someone's, especially if they have sort of pathological behavior. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm pretty good at reading people. But I think people who are actually pretty socially skilled or even like superficially charming can usually hold it together for 30 to 60 minutes, right? They can put on a good face and sort of get through it. So how I sort of, calibrate accordingly is what I call the 1 red flag rule. And so this is based on this premise that sort of pathological traits or behaviors, they're not expressed continually, right? So let's take the example of someone who has like an anger management problem. That doesn't mean they're literally angry 24 hours a day. The difference is, like I'm a person, for instance, who's not particularly angry. I might get angry like once a year, right? Once a month maybe. But someone who has an anger management problem may get pissed, let's say once a day, right? So the frequency in which that sort of behavior spikes is just more frequent than someone who's much lower on the spectrum. So the 1 red flag rule is basically even in a 30 to 60 minute interview, if you see a spike in sort of a pathological behavior, like they make an arrogant comment or they sort of belittle someone, it's almost a very high likelihood that that behavior is sort of expressed frequently, right? That if they couldn't even hold it together for 30 to 60 minutes and they sort of spiked in terms of that behavior, they're probably going to do it much more often throughout the days, the weeks, months, and years when they're actually working with you. The other way of sort of assessing this is just because you're trying to get a little bit more signal, is to do sort of realistic job simulations. So a lot of times with engineers, obviously, companies who do pair programming will invite engineers to come in for a day, sit with the team, and work on a project together, right? That's a great thing. I actually would argue it's not even as useful for assessing their technical competence, but literally just sitting there side by side and working with someone for a day, you get a pretty good sense of their personality. How well do they collaborate with other people? In hour 7 and they're sort of tired and stressed and hungry and haven't had a snack, like their personality sort of comes out. In fact, there's a startup, Weebly, the CEO likes to do a practice of actually for a lot of roles having people come in for a whole week, and they will pay them full market salary for that week and say, this is essentially a 1-week trial period. We're going to hit the ground running and see how you do. And there's a great quote that he has, and he says, assholes actually do a really good job of hiding it in interviews, but for some reason always comes out within a week, right? Because it's hard to hold it in for that period of time, right? So if that sort of behavior is spiking, they do a good job of sort of doing that. Now, obviously not every company can have someone come in and pay them for a week, and also really great candidates may not necessarily want to do that. But to me, that actually speaks very highly of a company that's willing to put their culture first, practice what they preach, and say, hey, because our bar is very high, that we're willing to sort of do this. And yes, it may sort of turn off some candidates who have a million job offers and don't want to go through that. But it's going to make sure that our company culture is good. So whatever that is for you, and you have to figure that out individually on an organizational basis. It could be just doing very, very rigorous interviewing so that when the 5 people on your team are interviewing, you're going through all 7 traits and you're comparing notes about that. And maybe 3 of your interviewers didn't even get to talk about grit, but a couple people were like, yeah, they told me a personal story about how they grew up and what they overcame in order to get into college and all of that. And so you can pick that up if all of you are sort of meticulously assessing for it. All right, how do you avoid them slipping through the cracks? Because this is a common thing. So as I said, interviews are sort of imperfect inherently, no matter how good you are at interviewing. But sort of taking a principle from statistics, I think it's really important to favor specificity over sensitivity. So if you remember your stats, the goal is really to avoid false positives. And the reality is when you're making sort of a determination of where your cutoff is, you have to sort of decide what's sort of worse, the false positives or the false negatives. I would actually argue if you really care about your company culture, you want to avoid the false positives, meaning you want to avoid the people who sort of seem fine, but they actually are sort of pathological people slipping through the cracks. Now, in order to do that, you will assuredly reject some people who may have been quite fine candidates, but for some reason they sort of came off a little skeezy, or it rubbed you the wrong way, or sort of your intuitive signal sort of came off wrong, or maybe a reference check came back negative, and they could have turned out to be just fine employee. But if you are sort of accidentally or falsely passing on 1 or 2 people in order to make sure that 1 or 2 really pathological people don't get in the door, I think it's well worth it. Because it is hard, unfortunately, to sort of fire people. And a lot of people, it takes a lot longer than most companies sort of claim to make that happen. So a lot of people talk about this philosophy. I think Sam Altman at YC talks about hire slow, fire fast. I think most people agree with it. Very few people practice it because it is obviously hard to do. So the best thing you can do is just set a very, very high bar in that if there is some disagreement on your team about hiring someone and you feel like the disagreement is logical and rational and they have good evidence for why this person on a cultural level is not a good fit, then better to weed them out. The other thing is the number one reason that the no asshole rule is not practiced, and Bob talks about this a lot in terms of the work that he does at Stanford, is because unfortunately there are people who are very high performers. And so there's often sort of rules that are bent because you get a star candidate who comes in the door and you're like, wow, this person's references were amazing, or we sat there and pair programmed and their work is phenomenal. Or it's just super hard to hire for these particular roles, particularly technical talent, obviously, in this day and age. So you're like, well, look, I can barely hire anyone. Look, we have to make compromises. And it's so understandable, right? You have so much empathy for that because this is a war for talent. We're all sort of competing with limited resources. But you have to sort of think about over time what sort of the overall cultural impact is and the overall net productivity impact. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. So the important thing is, and this is one of the things that I've observed in working with managers, is that you can't sort of do a calculus where you consider sort of values congruent and values incongruent behavior to sort of cancel each other out. Where they say, oh, well, this person is incredibly nice and works really well with managers, but they're terrible to their direct reports. And maybe that sort of cancels out to be like a net neutral. And you're like, no, that doesn't really work that way. So you have to sort of see values congruent behavior as a whole, and you can't sort of like say, okay, if they got 4 positive things going, 2 negative things going, they're like a +2 overall. Doesn't really work that way. So this is actually a construct, it's a framework that I came up with. It's called the Performance Values Matrix. And this is how you can sort of reward values during performance management. And just a note on language. Asshole is not a term that I use nor clinically nor scientifically or use with other people. But the reason I use it is because it's a common language. Like I could talk about empathic deficits and narcissistic tendencies with a very clinical lens. But the nice thing about asshole is just like the Supreme Court justice said about pornography, he's like, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And it's the same thing with an asshole. Most people know an asshole when they see it, even if they don't understand it. So that's why I use the term. The other thing is, this actually came out as a series of articles, and even though the praise was overwhelmingly positive, I would get occasional comments. Even though all throughout the article I use sort of gender-neutral language about guys and gals, and people are like, why do you only use guys here? And so, I just did that honestly for simplicity's sake. So don't sort of take that negatively. Obviously, guys and gals can be assholes, but I think, to be fair, men are far overrepresented in the asshole category. So if there's one place it's okay to be unequal, I would argue it's here. So this is sort of a framework for how you sort of use the principle of reinforcement to reward values. And I would actually argue, unless it's actually built into your performance management structure, people are going to get away with it, right? Because when push comes to shove, all behavior is sort of reinforced, right? And so if you're sort of implicitly reinforcing bad behavior, people don't care, right? Especially if they know, as long as I'm doing a good job, as long as I'm a high performer and I can act however the way I want, I'm going to still get a good performance review. So what incentive is there for me to behave positively? So what I did at one of my previous companies is work with our senior leadership team and say, hey, look, in our performance management, 50% of your performance management is going to be based on your performance behavior, and 50% of your performance evaluation is going to be based on how well you do in terms of value congruent behavior. And I would actually argue it's important to equally weight those things. Now, every company can sort of decide what their individual weighting is, but I actually think it sends a strong message to say, hey, it's just as important that you act as a team player and act in line with our values as do a good job technically in terms of your role. Now, this is obviously a spectrum. This is like more of a framework. Not everyone fits into a nice 2x2 consultant matrix. But in terms of your performance management, that could be evaluating people on a 1 to 10 scale. And so this is just like a nice simplistic way of sort of carving nature at the joints. So I want to talk about each of these 4 quadrants. So obviously the bottom left corner is what I kindly call incompetent assholes. So these are basically people who are both low performers and they're low on the value congruence. So obviously they can never get more than a 25% of the maximum score in your performance evaluation. Now, obviously, hopefully you have very few of these people at your company, but sometimes they do slip through the cracks. Oftentimes I actually see these people because of nepotism, where people are sort of hired preferentially. I saw, in fact, a founder hire their wife, and they were essentially unfireable. And so they got away with a lot of bad behavior as a result of that, both in terms of performance and values. Or in fact, it can be because of the incompetence of managers. Because if managers are sort of and they're sort of not meeting with their employees or not having a good eye on what they're sort of doing, people can get away with stuff. The other possibility is, of course, is sometimes both behavior and performance degrades over time. People obviously run into personal issues, psychological issues, and so people who might have been good employees sort of decrease over time. So now it's a rare thing, hopefully, that you see these sort of people, but the important thing I want to convey is that they have an outsized influence, right? They're very sort of toxic to organizations as morale killers. So obviously the critical thing is to fire fast. Identify these people, fire them as quickly as possible. Now, this is sort of the biggest sort of box of concern is sort of competent assholes. So these are people who are very high performers, but they're very low on sort of congruence. And by the way, just if you're curious what I mean by asshole, it's someone who sort of lacks empathic behavior to the point that it causes interpersonal issues. So the critical thing, as I talked about, is oftentimes assholes are sort of passively reinforced because they usually, in fact, get quite high performance evaluations if they're not using a framework like this, right? So you're sending the implicit message is, look, you can get away with murder as long as you're doing a good job or you're hitting your sales quota, right? So in this construct, though, they can never get more than a 50% even if they're phenomenal performers, perfect performers, in fact, but they're very, very low on values. So if you set up the reinforcement structure and say, hey, look, you can never get, in fact, a great performance evaluation unless you improve the values congruence behaviors, then even sometimes people who can be sort of pathological, whether dispositionally or because of the environment, can shift their behavior. Because if they're responsive to reinforcement and rewards, they'll be like, okay, you've changed the rules of the game and I'm going to play accordingly. Go ahead.
I think there's plenty of companies, and I love your reaction to this, where their implicit value is results.
Yep.
And so a competent asshole would actually be on the upper right box because the company, their value,
right,
their culture is
just results driven.
Is weighted heavily on results,
yep,
regardless of the interpersonal cost.
Absolutely. Well, you reap what you sow in that case, right? The company is going to get exactly what it wants, which is high-performing people who may or may not be sort of values congruent. But obviously, if that's the only thing they care about is the results, then they're going to probably get a much wider variance in terms of the people's value congruence. Now, the argument that I make is, so there's this myth in Silicon Valley of the 10x engineer, that engineer is 10x more productive or has the ability to produce more than 10 engineers at the same time. I would actually argue, even if that's theoretically true, if someone is truly like negative and pathological, especially someone in a managerial role who has a great interpersonal influence on the people around them, even though they may be very productive and results driven, the negative morale that they create around them causes a net productivity loss of the whole team. And so if you look at it more holistically, those people, because of sort of the drama and turmoil that they create, actually create less results and less performance over time, especially because sort of these things wear emotionally on people. You get churn, people leave, managers, not jobs. And so I think you have to sort of think about it in a much bigger picture. And I think a lot of those companies are in fact short-sighted because they're very focused on individual performance, not organizational performance. So the important thing to do with them is it's not immediately fire the competent assholes. Like obviously you do, it's hard to get high performing people. But I think just as we sort of put people who are low performers on a performance improvement plan, I actually would put them on a values improvement plan, the VIP. So the important thing is to use 360 reviews, and 360 is actually incredibly important because a lot of very savvy people manage up, right? It's the people that their direct reports that are often mistreated. So you have to incorporate their perspective as well and say, hey, look, you're a great performer, but our company values and company culture as well. And so it's going to be part of your values improvement plan to improve this over time. Now, hopefully they can rise to the occasion and improve that. And if not, you should fire them. Now, one caveat to that is a lot of times for the reason that people sort of engage in pathological behavior is because of personal or psychological problems. And so I actually highly recommend with those kind of people who you do want to keep, but you want to give them a chance to act better, is to refer them to therapy or executive coaching for some people, and that it can't always be managed within the organization because it could be sort of deep-seated problems or personal problems or family problems or whatever they're going through that they need sort of outside counsel. And I actually think it's a great and actually positive sign to say, hey, look, we do like your performance. There's something going on this other sort of behavioral quadrant, and let's provide you the resources to at least give you a chance to remediate that. And I have seen people who are a little bit more remediable rise to the occasion for that. Incompetent nice guys. I would actually argue these people who are low performers and very high on the values, they're like the people that you love. They're sort of the embodiment of your company's culture. People really like them. They add to the positive spirit, but they suck at their job. It's as much of a sin, in my opinion, to retain incompetent people as it is to tolerate assholes. Because it's the opposite, right? You're saying, well, if you're just nice or a brown noser, then that's okay. And we don't value performance here. So if you want to be a meritocracy at your company, don't send the message that being sort of socially or politically savvy is key. These are the people that you put on the performance improvement plans. The sort of the construct that I use is it's typically best to manage or move them. I've actually seen very sort of great people, but sort of low performers are in that position because they're not in the right fit, right? So oftentimes, because they're great people, you try to give them a chance and perhaps actually move them to a different role where maybe their skill sets or their strengths are better suited. And I've seen people actually improve their performance a lot because they just weren't in the right place. Like if they're sort of a very introverted person and they're in a very people-facing role, it's just difficult for them to achieve. So I would actually argue, though, and it's very hard, I think it's the hardest thing sometimes to fire these people, not the assholes, because they are sort of bastions of your company culture. But I would actually argue the nicest thing you can do is to not retain these people in a role that's unsuitable for them, right? Because if that's not really a good fit, they're never going to grow or develop in their career in that role. So the nicest thing you can do is sort of help them find a place where they're better suited to succeed. So the call to action here is reinforce your culture. You can actually do a lot to make sure that you have a good company culture, and that comes through reinforcement. And I think the observation that I see is that it's often leaders that are very Machiavellian that breed sort of mercenary employees. That's sort of typically where company culture is often very good at the beginning of the company, where it's sort of less than 20 people and you can literally all have lunch together and keep tabs on everyone. But as sort of company cultures scale, if you sort of take that sort of vantage point, like the question that you asked, where the ends justify the means, you end up getting employees that act accordingly. So the other sort of important thing, though, is that if you're trying to make efforts to remediate it, is you have to make sure that you have at least a culture that has openness, right? You may not be exactly where you're at in terms of you want to be in terms of your company culture, but people have to trust that the surveys that you do are generally anonymous. I'm a fan of anonymous surveys. And two, that they have to trust that the feedback is acted upon, right? So don't do surveys and then leave them on the table and give a presentation and don't do anything about them. Because if people don't trust that they're anonymous and they're not going to get in trouble for being honest, and they don't trust that you're going to do anything about them, you're never going to get honest feedback. And then you can never have an accurate pulse on how your company culture is. Then the final thought is we spend, especially in Silicon Valley, especially as technology companies, working on developing beautiful, amazing products, right? And we use methodologies like Agile and all these different things to make sure that we're constantly iterating on it. The argument that I would make, and I hope this is one of the things that you take home with you, is culture is a product. And in fact, it's just as important as the product that you're shipping to your customers, whether on the consumer or the enterprise side. And so using very same principles that you would use methodologically to develop good products, you need to continually assess those. So just as you use OKRs to assess your sort of team goals, you should literally use same principles, same best practices to think about your company culture as a product and develop ways of sort of bridging that gap through the principles of reinforcement. All right, so this is a little bit more of a clinical lens, which is why do people act the way that they do? So clinically, like I said, I never actually use the term asshole. It's not sort of used in a clinical context, but one of the ways of sort of understanding why people have empathic deficits is a cluster of personality traits called the dark triad. So these are what are called socially aversive personalities. And the three dark triad traits are psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. And the important thing to note is these traits are dimensional. All of us, including myself, we lie somewhere on a spectrum on these things. It's not to say that one person is a psychopath, one person is totally not. Now, obviously, there are cutoffs in clinical context where we say, okay, this person may actually have a disorder, but you can sort of assess this. By the way, there's something called the short dark triad test that you can take online if you're ever curious where you lie on the spectrum. It's important to be honest with yourself. The key thing that they share in common is they're all manipulative. People who are very high on these sort of traits, but they actually have very distinct motivations. So psychopaths are actually very driven by short-term rewards. They sort of engage in reckless antisocial behavior. But interestingly, people who are Machiavellian are motivated by long-term rewards. These are the people who sort of strategize and scheme and plot and think a year or two ahead in ways of getting them. Narcissists, on the other hand, are actually motivated by whatever boosts their ego. And that could be tangible rewards like wealth and fame, or anything that sort of bolsters their idealized self-image. So what is sort of a psychopath? So have you ever seen the movie Wall Street with Gordon Gekko? He's like the classic movie villain archetype of the psychopath. So in terms of their emotionality, these people are very callous and aggressive. These are the people who have sort of angry outbursts, or sometimes even physically violent, and they have very little remorse when they do that. And you could be sitting there in a meeting shocked why this person's yelling at this other person, and the other person is like, they don't care. Behaviorally, they actually end up being very impulsive and irresponsible. They sort of blatantly disregard oftentimes the safety of themselves and other people, engaging in very sensation-seeking behavior, and in sort of negative corporate extreme examples like Enron, they gleefully defy norms and laws, right? So they'll lie, cook the books, manipulate, sometimes for profit, sometimes for fun, as disturbing as that is. That's why they're psychopaths. Now, clinically, we call that antisocial personality disorder. The good thing is that only 1% to 2% of the general population actually meets the clinical criteria for having antisocial personality. The bad news is it's very overrepresented amongst CEOs. So it's higher than 1% to 2%. There's a great book, if you're ever curious, it's called Snakes in Suits. That talks about this phenomenon. Great portrayals, obviously, Wall Street, American Psycho, Patrick Bateman. And as I said, the characteristic of this is the short-term focus. They live for sort of immediate gratification, even at the long-term expense. And that's oftentimes how they get in trouble, is because they sort of engage in behavior that's very reckless that usually catches up with them in the long term. Machiavellianism is, if you're fan of House of Cards, Frank Underwood. So this is the ends justify the means. This is sort of the classic strategic cunning manipulator. This is actually a unique trait because it's actually not a DSM disorder. We wouldn't actually classify this as sort of a mental illness. It's more of a pernicious thing. I actually argue it's more of a state than a trait in the sense that psychopaths are generally born. Most people don't really become psychopaths, but people can definitely become Machiavellian, and there's a whole host of sort of psychological studies like the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram studies that show that if you sort of use influential leadership in coercive environments, you can get ordinary people to do very sort of bad things, right? So, and unfortunately, Silicon Valley, I think, in my opinion, actually encourages this because there's a lot of ethos that we sort of promote, like do what it takes, move fast and break things, ask for forgiveness, not permission, hiring employees that are hustlers. That's the funniest one to me because the literal definition of a hustler is someone who like cheats and steals and manipulates, right? But we love hustlers in Silicon Valley. And I think that's not an accidental term. The difference, of course, versus the psychopaths is they have a long-term focus. They plan ahead, they form alliances, they very carefully maintain their reputations. And oftentimes it's often shielding sort of family and friends from what's going on and what they're doing. The last one is sort of narcissism. Unfortunately, the picture of this is supposed to be Tony Stark from Iron Man. These people have sort of this is the classic political leaders that we're very familiar with who have grandiose self-confidence. They're very self-centered, smug, and self-serving. The funny thing, though, is if you think about it from a psychological lens, the sort of the ridiculous ego is actually coming out of a deep-seated sense of insecurity. So these people are constantly sort of reinforcing a very fragile ego through getting validation from other people and even sometimes deceiving themselves. That's a funny thing. They almost like believe their own lies over time. Now, when their ego is threatened, oftentimes these people fly into what's called a narcissistic rage, where they get sort of very angry or aggressive and defensive when their ego or their self-image is sort of threatened. And the challenge, of course, with that is that they're not vulnerable people. And if you think about sort of vulnerability as being the foundation for intimacy, these people often have very superficial, unempathic relationships, even with their romantic partners if they're married. They're very antagonistic. These are the people who are lying, manipulative, threatening to get their way. And they're also sort of uninhibited in terms of doing things that are to seem exciting or daring if it puts off that sort of image of the person that they want to seem to the world. Now, the thing that I want to clarify is that some ego is actually healthy for a resilient self-esteem. All of us have some ego and perhaps in some contexts have acted a little narcissistic. But there's a key difference between confidence and sort of arrogance. And I sort of distinguish that as confidence is based on actual accomplishments or when you're adhering to sort of your values, versus arrogance is more of actually a defense against that underlying inadequacy, which is why narcissism is often called sort of malignant self-love. It's like a self-love that's not sort of congruent with the reality of the matter. Now, it's only 6% prevalent in the population, a little bit higher in men, 8% versus 5% in women. And if you're interested in further reading, there's a great book on it called The Drama of the Gifted Child about sort of how narcissism develops. So we got a few minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about, we don't have time to show the clip, but I'm sure you've all seen The Social Network about sort of the history of Facebook. There's a great sort of opening scene, if you recall, where the fictional Mark Zuckerberg, I'll caveat it with that, is on a date with this woman, Erica, and there's a great line where she breaks up with him at the end because he's sort of engaging in all these social faux pas and sort of insulting her, and says, you're probably going to be a very successful computer person. You're going to go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd, and I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole. And so he's sort of dumbfounded by this at the beginning of the movie, and then obviously goes on to start Facebook. But it's sort of an interesting phenomenon, and because the end of the movie, he's engaging with another woman, Marilyn, who's his lawyer, right? So they've gone all through the proceedings of being sued, and she says something really interesting, and I think a lot of people miss this in the movie, is she says, you're not an asshole, Mark, you're just trying so hard to be. Right? So, and I think the brilliance of the movie actually is that in this previous scene, Erica thinks that Mark is an asshole, right? He's sort of exemplifying the dark triad traits that I've sort of talked about, because he's kind of like inconsiderate and sort of offends her and says he's sort of above her and she's beneath him. But he's oblivious. Like when she actually tries to break up with him, he doesn't understand what she's doing or why, and I can't believe this is happening, right? Later what happens is, and I think this is very astute of his attorney, is she realizes that he's actually not an asshole. He's sort of more of an accidental asshole. And in the process of sort of becoming the Facebook CEO and guru, he sort of takes on the archetype of what he thinks a CEO should be, which is this very like hard-driving, deal bargaining kind of guy, because that's what he thinks like a leader should be. And so he almost tries to fit the mold of what he perceives the CEO to be and ends up acting like an asshole in the result, even though that's sort of not his true personality, right? So this, I think, was a very interesting observation that I sort of noticed, in that I also started noticing this behavior in a lot of the companies that I was working with, in the sense that you get the accidental asshole. So these are not people actually on the dark triad trait. Oftentimes these are people who actually have high functioning autism. So this used to be called Asperger's disorder before it was sort of changed to high functioning autism in the DSM-5. But it's just a very important distinction, because people sort of on the dark triad spectrum are very insensitive usually to other people, while people who are on the autism spectrum are actually more indifferent. They're not actually assholes, but they sort of lack empathy in a way that makes them seem like assholes, right? So, and the difference is, and this is a very important point, because a lot of people talk about empathy, but clinicians actually distinguish between two different types of empathy, which is cognitive versus affective empathy. So cognitive empathy is the capacity to understand someone else's mental state, while affective empathy is the capacity to respond with an appropriate emotion to someone else's mental state. So a classic example is, let's say you see your friend fall down and they tear their jeans, right? So cognitive empathy would be to realize, oh man, that must be really embarrassing for that person to experience that. Affective or emotional empathy would be like to say, oh no, let me go help them, right? You feel that emotionally and you have a genuine desire to go help the person. Now, in most sort of normal functioning people, both of these things are intact. The fascinating thing is, in the two sort of disorders that I mentioned, they're both actually deficient in one or the other. So in autism spectrum, they are impaired in terms of their cognitive empathy, but their affective empathy is intact. They have hard time sort of understanding or being in understanding someone else's shoes, but emotionally, they sort of feel it, right? So these are why people who with autism spectrum are more asocial. They have interpersonal difficulties because they have trouble understanding social situations. On the other hand, people who are on the dark triad spectrum have literally the flip-flop opposite. Their cognitive empathy is intact. They understand that their actions hurt other people. They just don't feel it. They don't really care, right? These people are antisocial as opposed to asocial. So they have interpersonal difficulties because they understand social situations, but they're sort of selfish and self-interested, and they don't care the consequences of their behavior. Now, it is possible to have both and have sort of little cognitive or affective empathy, which is sort of the black box in the bottom. The fascinating thing is they have sort of different motivations at work. So there's a beautiful essay that was written sort of about the difference between these two spectrums. And people with autism spectrum, if they're working, they're focused on building a better box, on the box itself, how it's made, how I can improve it, what else it can be used for. They want other people to hear about the box, share in their enthusiasm, be understanding or they're respectful about their enthusiasm about the box being whatever they're working on. Now, people on the dark triad spectrum, they're focused on getting credit for building a better box. Whether they built it or not, they want to be seen as the box builder. They want to be the most expert box builder. And how can that box make them money, further their personal agenda, or hide the fact that someone else built the box? And the best example of this, of course, is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. So if you watch the clip, there's a great story of how when Steve was at Atari, he asked to have his own project in order to fix the game and was given a $5,000 reward if he could pull it off. What he did is he actually got Woz to build it for him, lied to Woz and said the reward was only $700 and took the money for himself. The sad part, this is a true story, is Woz only found out about this like decades later when he was reading a book about the history of Atari and found out that his best friend pilfered him, basically. So what ends up happening is you sort of see this parasitic symbiosis between these two people, because they're each sort of lacking affective or cognitive empathy, but they often almost make good partners in crime, because the box builder is the person building it and the other one's sort of getting credit for it, and so they become this sort of tag team duo that kind of complements each other's deficits. The challenge, though, is that these relationships are ultimately unstable, and as you've sort of watched the movie or read the history, Woz ultimately quit Apple because he didn't think it was a very nice place to work. Obviously, with people sort of on the dark triad trait, just as we talked about sort of with the competent assholes, the key is to remediate or separate them. If they do end up staying at your organization, you really need to monitor these people for their social impact, because they can be very damaging if they're disruptive or they're exploitative to other people. Sometimes they can do okay in organizations if they're in individual contributor roles, often non-managerial, that accentuates their strengths. It's like sometimes I have seen in very like on-the-road sales kind of positions where their superficial charm and the fact that they don't need to maintain long-term relationships because it's a quick sale, they can do just fine, and they don't have to manage anyone and just kind of put them on their task. But I think it's very important to use that performance values matrix that we talked about to at least reinforce as much of their pro-social behavior as possible and punish, obviously, the antisocial behavior. The other model that I've seen sort of work, and this is classic examples in terms of using sort of Facebook, is if there are very like high IQ CEOs that are not so great on the interpersonal front, they're often balanced with high EQ COOs, right? This is sort of like the Cheryl to the Mark, that can provide more holistically as a team a sort of a positive way of complementing sort of the deficits. So that's something to think about as well. The unfortunate thing is a lot of people sort of watch the example of Steve Jobs in the movie and think that's an excuse to sort of act like jerks. So the caveat I always say is, look, you're not Steve Jobs. Unlike Machiavellian princes, it's better to be loved than feared as a leader. So if you should really embody the light by obviously trying to promote a good company culture. But I also think you have to understand and manage the dark side. We can't pretend that everyone at all organizations, including ourselves, are perfect angels, right? And that's why I think it's actually useful to talk about this in terms of a clinical or pathological spectrum, so you can understand why people do the way why they are the way they are and why they act the way that they do, and how can you manage that in the way that at least minimizes damage and promotes the maximum possible benefit. Awesome. One other thing, interestingly, if you talk about it from an individual perspective, psychopathy obviously is sort of the worst in terms of damaging, probably followed by narcissism, probably followed by Machiavellianism. But I would actually argue organizationally, Machiavellianism, in my opinion, is actually the most dangerous of the dark triad. The reason is, like I said, maybe only 1% to 2% of people are psychopaths, maybe 6% to 8% of people are narcissists, but anyone can become Machiavellian. So that's the danger, is even though it's the least extreme of the behaviors, it's the most learnable and it's the most contagious. Right, and so you do see organizations, great examples like Wells Fargo with the whole sales quota that they had, where it can be very pernicious, where if the company's ethos is to sort of manipulate and the ends justify the means, people will act accordingly. A lot of people who are not particularly that way will become that way. So that's why I actually argue that even though you do have the outliers and it's harder to control those people, although you can try to manage it, is organizationally make sure that you don't sort of become Machiavellian. All right, so these are just sort of stories we're going to skip over, but that's my time for today, and thank you for your attention. Do you have time for questions still? Okay. Go for it.
I just have a question about company culture and, startup, it's like hire slowly, fire quickly. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that with giving people 360 reviews and trying to help remediate them and help them succeed within the organization? Like, at what point do you just say, okay, we need to fire quickly if it's not working out, versus run all these programs to help them?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably no easy answer to that question because it depends on the role and it also depends on how easy they are to replace, right? I would say that's a critical function where if you know that the time to hire someone else in a key technical role is going to be another 6 months, you may want to balance that against being like, all right, let's give this person 6 months. We may even kick off a candidate search at that time. And if you have to sort of weigh that in terms of how that impacts your company culture as well. But I think you have to sort of judge that against the individual position. I generally at least do like giving people like one chance, unless the behavior is very pernicious, right? If you're getting very clear signal that this person is on the extreme outlier of pathology or acting in a way where it's going to be detrimental, don't make your organization suffer for 6 months through this person. There's ways of either containing it. You can say, hey, we're going to put you in a different sort of role. Maybe we'll give you a chance to remediate and then put you back. But those are things that you just have to sort of figure out what the right balance is in terms of how extreme the behavior is and how likely do you think that the chances that the person's going to improve, right? Now, it could be like a 6-month plan, but like you can get signal within the first few weeks if someone's making a concerted effort, right? You don't necessarily need to drag it on forever to make that call.
What are some objective ways to assess people, these kind of scales?
The dark triad scales. I don't think it's necessarily the job of organizations to be sort of like assessing people's like clinical level of pathology. I guess that's sort of my job, but I think it's more useful for the reason that I share it is I think it's useful for people to be aware of these phenomenon. Right? Because you obviously see people acting in negative ways and treating other people, but we don't often understand why that is, right? And so when you sort of have a framework for understanding that, then I think you can actually increase your own empathy for it. Like the example of like the accidental hassle is a great example, right? Where some people may be a little bit more socially oblivious and sort of that they rub people the wrong way for a very different reason than someone who is more on the dark triad spectrum. And so if you sort of understand that, I think you can adjust your own behavior accordingly. So that's the key thing. I would say if I had to sort of put my focus, it's more on sort of the performance values matrix, which is saying, look, my job is not to necessarily diagnose you, but we can sort of manage you as much as possible. And if you do sort of suspect or pick up on some of these things, you can refer to people who can perhaps help them and do a better job sort of diagnosing and treating that.
I have a question. So you talked a lot about company culture. And in my mind, there's a thing as culture and then there's core values. And you said, don't establish a culture if you can't live up to it. Mm-hmm. But don't you think every company that starts, even if it's a startup, they should have some core values, things they don't bend on, no matter how the situation moves, like respect for people,
sure,
or like ethical behavior.
Right.
Is that something you observe? Do you see in the startup culture that often people fail to establish that early on? And do you think that's absolutely necessary?
Well, I think I would agree that every company should have core values. The problem is the discrepancy, right? I think if you actually go back and read what Enron stated as their core values, I think like something around ethics was actually in there. It was a far cry from like the fraud they committed, right? So, but that's my whole point is. If people are running around doing unethical things and they literally see ethics or integrity is written on the wall, then it's a joke, right? And I almost think it's even more pernicious to be hypocritical about it. So that's why I'm saying have core values, but live the values as well. Don't just pay lip service to it.
You've got the performance values matrix.
Yep.
I've seen a lot of the performance potential matrix, performance on one axis, the potential of the person, to essentially to perform.
Yeah.
That makes it pretty, you put those all together, that gets pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? You actually go with performance values as the key. The key evaluation.
I guess if you want to simplify it, you can sort of build in the potential into the performance, which is, like, is this person sort of been here for a long time, maxing out on their potential, you don't think there's a lot of upside, or maybe this person's new to the role, they've been promoted into a position, they do have some learning to do, they're not, and so you just incorporate that into your assessment of their performance, right? You just weigh that in and say, like, how much do I believe, given the person's context and the trajectory, that I'm going to weigh that, maybe not weigh their performance as harshly if this is something that like they're new and they're making a concerted effort, right?
Let's do one more question.
Let's go all the way in the back.
I actually had a question for you. Since Steve Jobs is dead,
Yeah.
Which of the current role models do you think fall into the asshole category?
I don't think you can have a role model that's an asshole, quite frankly. That's why if you sort of noted from the performance values matrix, I actually in the top right quadrant made a distinguishment between competent and outstanding nice guys. I think you should set a high bar as a company, right? In terms of just because you're nice and you do a generally good job, it doesn't mean you're like a high performer. You really have to be an exemplar, go out of your way in terms of living the company's values, do the dishes, pick up the trash, like really do the little stuff, and also be a very high performer in order to be an outstanding nice guy. If you note, I did not put outstanding asshole in the top left quadrant, because I actually believe you cannot truly be outstanding if you are an asshole, because you're intrinsically limiting your potential. And although there are very strong outliers like Steve Jobs that produce outsized performance, you could make an argument that their performance or the retention of their employees would have been even better if they had a little bit of help. But oftentimes I would say those companies that have still made it work, they're freakishly talented individuals who are surrounded by people who often make up for their deficits.
What about Elon and Zuckerberg right now? These are people actually entrepreneurs really look up to.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of what you just said, kind of, leads into both of those really smart people, right?
Right.
They're really leading to industry changing companies, and people look at them and say, well, if it's working for them, it's going to work for us, and that's where all the behaviors come from. How do you define those two?
Yeah, so first of all, like I don't diagnose anyone dead or alive that I don't treat. That's like the sort of the Goldwater rule. My sort of assessment of these are based on the fictional movie portrayals of these people. So you can sort of take that for what you will. Now, I do think you're right in that we sort of laud and apotheosize these sort of figures because of the results that they produce. But I think it's a huge mistake to think that we can emulate them, because those individuals, like both on an individual basis and also the organizations they ran, are very unique creatures. But I think if the idea is to sort of use that as a template for running an ideal culture, most people are going to run their organizations into the ground. I don't think you can even follow organizational processes like those companies did. They're unique companies in terms of the way that they're run, and it's the same thing in terms of their company cultures. So I actually think that you're much better set up to use a more balanced framework and not sort of lionize individual leaders, and sort of develop your own sort of leadership ideal and grow into that rather than necessarily emulating someone else. All right, thank you very much. I know we're over time, but feel free to reach out. You can always email me, connect on LinkedIn or Twitter.